The morning rain had just stopped, leaving the streets of Westchester gleaming like polished glass. 17-year-old Marcus Thompson stood at the iron gates of the Blackwood estate, his worn sneakers soaked through, his only good shirt, salvaged from a church donation box, clinging to his thin frame. He'd been standing there since dawn, waiting for the right moment, gathering courage that felt as fragile as the last $20 hidden in his shoe. The mansion beyond the gates looked like something from another world. Marcus had seen it only in newspaper photos before today, usually accompanying articles about Richard Blackwood's latest billion-dollar acquisition or charitable foundation announcement. In person, it was even more intimidating. 3 stories of limestone and glass that seemed to judge him for even daring to stand at its entrance. Marcus's hands trembled as he held up the cardboard sign he'd made the night before. The letters, written in black marker, were starting to run from the rain. "Please, I want a job." Simple words, but they'd taken him hours to write. How do you compress desperation into a few words? How do you explain that your mother is dying, that the hospital bills are drowning you, that you haven't eaten in 2 days because The morning rain had just stopped, leaving the streets of Westchester gleaming like polished glass. 17-year-old Marcus Thompson stood at the iron gates of the Blackwood estate, his worn sneakers soaked through, his only good shirt, salvaged from a church donation box, clinging to his thin frame. He'd been standing there since dawn, waiting for the right moment, gathering courage that felt as fragile as the last $20 hidden in his shoe. The mansion beyond the gates looked like something from another world. Marcus had seen it only in newspaper photos before today, usually accompanying articles about Richard Blackwood's latest billion-dollar acquisition or charitable foundation announcement. In person, it was even more intimidating. 3 stories of limestone and glass that seemed to judge him for even daring to stand at its entrance. Marcus's hands trembled as he held up the cardboard sign he'd made the night before. The letters, written in black marker, were starting to run from the rain. "Please, I want a job." Simple words, but they'd taken him hours to write. How do you compress desperation into a few words? How do you explain that your mother is dying, that the hospital bills are drowning you, that you haven't eaten in 2 days because every dollar needs to go toward her medicine? The security camera above the gate whirred, focusing on him. Marcus straightened his shoulders and held the sign higher. This was it. This was his last chance. The intercom crackled to life. "Mr. Blackwood will be out shortly. He wants to see you himself." Marcus's heart leapt. Maybe the rumors were true. Maybe Richard Blackwood really did help those in need. Maybe he'd understand. Maybe... The front door of the mansion opened, and a figure emerged. Richard Blackwood walked with the confidence of a man who'd conquered worlds, his Italian suit worth more than most people's cars. But as he drew closer, Marcus saw something else in his face, a flicker of recognition that made the billionaire's steps falter for just a moment. Their eyes met through the iron bars of the gate. Marcus saw the exact moment when recognition fully dawned in Richard's eyes. The billionaire, whose face had held a hint of curiosity, suddenly turned to stone. "Dad!" The word escaped Marcus's lips as a whisper, barely audible. Tears were already streaming down his face. "Dad, please! It's me! It's Marcus! Mom is dying! She needs help, please! I know you hate her, but..." Richard Blackwood stood perfectly still, his jaw clenched so tight a muscle twitched in his cheek. For a long moment, father and son stared at each other through the prison of iron bars. One who had everything, one who had nothing. "I have no son," Richard said, his voice as cold as winter frost. "Security, remove him from the property. If he returns, call the police." "Dad, please!" Marcus grabbed the dates, rattling them desperately. "She's dying! Your daughter, Sophie! She cries every night! We have nothing! Please!" But Richard Blackwood had already turned away, walking back to his mansion with measured steps, never looking back. Not even when Marcus's sobs echoed across the manicured lawn. Not even when his son collapsed to his knees in the rain, still clutching the pathetic cardboard sign. To understand how a father could walk away from his dying son's plea, we need to go back 15 years, to when the Blackwood family was still the Thompson family, and happiness wasn't yet a word that tasted like ash. 15 years earlier, the Thompson house on Maple Street wasn't much to look at from the outside, a modest two-story colonial with peeling paint and a mailbox that leaned slightly to the left. But inside, it was filled with the kind of warmth that money couldn't buy. "Daddy, look, I drew you." 5-year-old Sophie held up a crayon masterpiece featuring a stick figure with enormous muscles and a red cape. Richard Thompson, then a struggling insurance adjuster, swept his daughter into his arms. "Is that me as a superhero?" "You are a superhero, Daddy." From the kitchen, the sound of laughter mixed with the sizzle of Saturday morning pancakes. Elena Thompson appeared in the doorway, her dark hair pulled back in a messy bun, flour dusting her cheek. "Breakfast is ready, my loves." 2-year-old Marcus toddled over to his father, arms raised. "Up, up." Richard managed to balance both children, carrying them into the kitchen where Elena had set the table with their mismatched dishes, wedding gifts from various relatives that somehow made every meal feel like a celebration. "I have news," Richard announced over breakfast, unable to contain his smile. "Henderson Insurance wants to promote me to regional manager. It's a 60% pay raise. We could finally fix the roof, maybe even start that college fund we've been talking about." Elena reached across the table, squeezing his hand. "I knew it would happen. You work so hard for us." "We're a team," Richard said, looking at each member of his family. "Everything I do is for you three." That evening, after the children were asleep, Richard found Elena on the back porch, staring at the stars. He wrapped his arms around her from behind. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "How lucky we are," she murmured. "Not everyone gets this. This perfect little life." "It's not perfect," Richard said, kissing her temple. "The house needs work, we're behind on the car payment, and—" "It's perfect to me," Elena interrupted, turning in his arms. "You, me, are babies. That's all I'll ever need." They slow-danced on the creaky porch boards. No music, except the cricket symphony and the distant sound of wind chimes. Richard would remember this moment later, turning it over in his mind like a photograph fading at the edges, wondering if the signs were already there, if he'd simply chosen not to see them. The changes started small. Elena joined a gym, said she wanted to feel good about herself again. Richard supported her, even though the membership stretched their budget. She bought new clothes, just a few pieces, she promised, for the confidence boost. She started working late at the dental office, where she was a receptionist, explaining that Dr. Mitchell needed help with the new filing system. Richard noticed, but didn't worry. Marriage was about trust, after all. One Thursday evening, Richard came home early with Chinese takeout, Elena's favorite, planning to surprise her. Her car was in the driveway, but the house was quiet. Too quiet. "Elena?" he called, setting the food on the kitchen counter. "Kids?" Sophie and Marcus were at his mother's house for their weekly sleepover. It should have just been him and Elena, a rare evening alone. He heard voices from upstairs. Elena's laugh, but different somehow, breathless. Then a man's voice, deep and unfamiliar. Richard's feet felt leaden as he climbed the stairs. Each step creaked under his weight, sounds he knew by heart from years of checking on sleeping children.
The master bedroom door was slightly open. Through the crack, he saw them. Elena, his Elena, in the arms of a man Richard recognized as Dr. Mitchell, her boss, a man who'd been to their house for barbecues, who'd played with their children.
The Chinese food bag slipped from Richard's numb fingers, hitting the floor with a dull thud. Elena's head snapped toward the door, her eyes meeting Richard's through the narrow opening. For a moment, time stopped. Then her expression changed, not to guilt or remorse, but to something Richard had never seen before: relief. "Richard," she said, pulling on a robe with casual indifference, "I suppose we should talk." The conversation that followed was brutal in its efficiency. Elena had been seeing Mitchell for 8 months. She was in love. She wanted a divorce. She'd already seen a lawyer. "The children stay with me," she announced, as if discussing grocery arrangements. "Mitchell has a beautiful house in Riverside, better schools. They'll have opportunities you could never give them." "You can't just take them," Richard said, his voice breaking. "They're my children too. The lawyer says I'll get primary custody. I'm their mother, I'm the primary caregiver, and Mitchell can provide better for them." She was packing as she spoke, folding clothes with mechanical precision. "You can have visitation every other weekend." "Elena, please, whatever's wrong, we can fix it. Counseling, therapy." She laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "There's nothing to fix, Richard. I don't love you anymore. Maybe I never really did. You were safe, comfortable, but Mitchell makes me feel alive. What about our vows, for better or worse?" "Words, Richard, just words." She zipped up her suitcase. "I'm taking the children and staying with Mitchell tonight. You'll be hearing from my lawyer." The next months were a blur of legal documents and empty bottles. The court favored Elena, as she had predicted. She got the children, the house, which had to be sold to split the assets, and half of Richard's meager retirement fund. Richard got every other weekend and a dingy apartment on the wrong side of town. But the cruelest blow came when he arrived for his first scheduled visitation. "They don't want to see you," Elena said, not even opening the door fully. Mitchell stood behind her, proprietary hand on her shoulder. "That's not possible. Let me talk to them." "Richard, they're adjusting to their new life. Mitchell is wonderful with them. Don't confuse them." Through the window, Richard could see Marcus playing with toys he could never be able to afford. Sophie was in a princess dress, being twirled around by Mitchell. They were laughing. "They're my children." "And you'll see them when they're ready. The court gave me discretion on visitation if it's in the children's best interest." The door closed in his face. Richard tried everything. He called daily. Elena changed the number. He sent letters. They came back unopened. He drove by their school just to catch a glimpse, until a restraining order made that impossible too. Elena had told the court she felt threatened by his obsessive behavior. Rock Bottom has a basement, Richard discovered. He lost his job due to missed work from court dates and depression. The apartment went next. He found himself sleeping in his car, showering at the gym until his membership expired, eating at soup kitchens when pride allowed. One rainy night, sitting in his car outside a closed McDonald's, using their Wi-Fi to job hunt on a cracked phone, Richard made a decision. He could let this break him, or he could rise from these ashes, not for Elena, never again for her, but for himself, and maybe someday for the children who might remember their real father. He started with night presses and coding, paid for by cleaning office buildings from midnight to dawn. He taught himself investment strategies in the library, living on ramen and determination. His first app, a simple budget tracker, sold for $5,000. He invested every penny, living like he was still homeless, even when he could afford better. The second app did better. The third caught the attention of a venture capitalist. Within 5 years, Richard had built and sold 2 companies. Within 10, he was running a tech empire. The man who'd once counted pennies for gas now had penthouses in 3 cities. But Richard Thompson was dead. In his place stood Richard Blackwood. He'd legally changed his name, shedding his past like an old skin. He dated occasionally, but never seriously. He trusted no one with more than business.
His heart had been surgically removed, replaced with spreadsheets and profit margins. Sometimes, late at night in his massive bedroom, he wondered about Marcus and Sophie. Were they happy? Did they ever think of him? But these thoughts were dangerous luxuries, so he buried them under work, under success, under the kind of wealth that should have made him feel something other than empty. He hired a private investigator once, just to know. The report sat unopened in his safe for a year before he finally read it. Elena and Mitchell were married. The children used Mitchell's last name at school. They looked healthy, well-adjusted, happy. Richard burned the report and never hired another investigator. Some wounds were meant to stay closed. Present day. Elena Mitchell lay in the hospital bed, her once beautiful face gaunt and yellow with jaundice. The cancer had started in her pancreas and spread everywhere, as if her body was eating itself from the inside out as punishment for her past sins. "Mom, you need to eat something," Sophie begged, holding a cup of broth with shaking hands. At 19, she should have been in college, but she'd dropped out to care for her mother and work double shifts at a diner. "Where's Marcus?" Elena whispered, her voice paper-thin. "He's trying to find help, Mom. He'll be back soon." Elena closed her eyes. She knew where Marcus had gone. She'd seen the news about Richard's success, watched from afar as her ex-husband became one of the wealthiest men in America. She'd forbidden Marcus from reaching out, but desperation makes liars of us all. Dr. Mitchell, she still couldn't think of him as anything else, even after 10 years of marriage, had left 2 years ago, when his medical license was revoked for prescription fraud. He'd been stealing and selling opioids, using their joint accounts to hide the money. When the authorities caught up, he'd fled the country, leaving Elena to face the legal consequences and bankruptcy. The beautiful riverside house was seized, the cars, the jewelry, the life she'd traded everything for. All gone. They'd moved into a moldy apartment in the same neighborhood where Richard once lived in his car. The irony wasn't lost on Elena, but she was too sick to care about cosmic justice. Marcus burst through the hospital room door, his face telling the story before his words could. "He wouldn't help, Mom. I begged him. I told you you were dying. He looked right at me and said he has no son." Elena felt something break inside her chest that had nothing to do with cancer. "I'm sorry," she whispered, reaching for Marcus's hand. "I'm so sorry, my baby. This is all my fault." "Don't say that. No, listen to me, both of you." Elena struggled to sit up, Sophie rushing to help. "I need to tell you the truth about your father, your real father."
Over the next hour, Elena confessed everything. How she'd cheated on Richard, not because he was a bad husband, but because she was bored. How she'd poisoned the children against him with lies about abandonment. How she'd used the legal system to keep him away, not for their protection, but for her convenience. How Mitchell had seemed like an upgrade, wealthier, more sophisticated, until his true nature revealed itself after the wedding. "The man you begged today," Elena said to Marcus, "was the only parent who truly loved you unconditionally, and I stole that from you, from all of us." Sophie was sobbing. Marcus sat frozen, his face a mask of disbelief. "Why?" Sophie asked. "Why would you do that to us? To him?" "Because I was selfish," Elena said simply. "Because I thought I deserved better. Because I was a fool who learned too late that better isn't always about money or excitement. Sometimes it's about the man who works overtime to buy your children Christmas presents, who slow dances with you on a creaky porch, who loves you even when you're at your worst." She died 2 days later, her children holding her hands, forgiveness on their lips, but not quite in their hearts. At the funeral, attended by only a handful of people, Marcus stood to give the eulogy. He looked at the sparse crowd, a few former coworkers, a neighbor, the hospital chaplain, and then his eyes caught something. A man, in the very back row, dressed in black, face hidden behind sunglasses. Marcus's voice caught.
He knew that posture, that way of holding his shoulders. For a moment, their eyes met across the rows of empty chairs. Then Richard Blackwood stood and walked out, his footsteps echoing in the silence. Marcus never saw him again, but a week later, an envelope arrived with no return address. Inside was a check for exactly the amount of Elena's medical bills and funeral expenses. Nothing more, nothing less. No note, no contact information. Sophie wanted to cash it. Marcus couldn't. They fought about it for hours. "He's still our father," Sophie argued. "He's trying to help." "He had his chance to help when she was alive. This isn't help. This is guilt money." They compromised by putting the check in a drawer, unable to cash it, unable to throw it away. It sat there like a question neither could answer. What is the price of forgiveness? What is the cost of betrayal? Can love survive everything, or are some wounds too deep to heal? 6 months later, Marcus was accepted to college on a full scholarship. Academic, he was told, though the administrator seemed surprised herself. Sophie's student loans were mysteriously paid off by an anonymous benefactor. They both knew, but never spoke it aloud. Richard Blackwood continued to build his empire, his charity foundations helping thousands of children from broken homes. But he never remarried, never had other children, never again allowed anyone close enough to betray him. Sometimes he drove past the university where Marcus was studying engineering. Catching glimpses of the young man who looked so much like him, it hurt. Sometimes he attended Sophie's dance recitals from the balcony, leaving before the lights came up. He watched his children build their lives from the shadows, a ghost of the father he could have been. And on quiet nights, in his mansion that echoed with emptiness, Richard would stand at the same gates where Marcus had begged him, wondering if he'd made the right choice. If refusing to help Elena had been justice or cruelty. If protecting his heart had cost him his soul. But forgiveness, he'd learned, wasn't a currency you could trade. It was a gift, freely given or forever withheld. Elena had died without his forgiveness, but perhaps that was its own kind of mercy. For both of them. The children would go on to live their lives, Marcus becoming an engineer, Sophie a teacher. They would marry, have children of their own, and tell them about the grandfather who watched from afar but never came close. They would tell them about choices and consequences, about the price of betrayal and the cost of pride. And sometimes, on Father's Day, a card would arrive at Richard's office. No signature, no return address, just 3 words. "We understand now." It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't reunion, but it was something. And for a man who lost everything twice, once to betrayal, once to his own cold heart, something was more than he dared hope for. What do you think about this story? Did the father do the right thing by refusing to help his ex-wife, even though it meant his children would suffer? Was his coldness justified after such a profound betrayal, or should forgiveness have won over pride? If this story touched your heart or made you think about the complexities of family, forgiveness, and the consequences of our choices, please like this video and subscribe to Parent Tales for more thought-provoking stories that explore the depths of human nature. What would you have done if you were in Richard's shoes? Could you have walked away from your child's desperate plea, knowing their mother was dying? Or would you have chosen forgiveness, even for someone who destroyed your life? Let us know in the comments below. Sometimes life doesn't give us clear heroes and villains, just broken people making impossible choices. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey. Until next time, bye!